Hello, and welcome to another episode of Code and Pixels. My name is Kelly, and I'm once again joined by my amazing co-host Adekunle. Today, we'll be chatting with Mike Aparicio about scaling CSS in design systems.
Mike is a principal design system engineer at Turquoise Health. Hey, Mike, thanks for being on the show. How are things going?
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Cool. All right, so let's get into the first question. So, can you describe your career path from the first job to where you're at right now?
Yes, it's been a long journey. I started many years ago in the 90s in college. I wanted to make video games for a living, so I went into computer science at U of I, and then I took my first math class and ended up writing my name on it and turning it in blank. And then it was at that point I decided that computer science was not for me. So I decided, what can I major in that requires no math? And the answer was sports journalism. And this was around the time Michael Jordan made his comeback in like 1995, and this also coincided with like the launch of Mozilla around that time frame. And so I started doing Bull's website as a hobby, and never occurred to me that someone would pay me money to make websites. But a few years later, a friend that I went to college with was like, hey, we need a webmaster. Are you interested? And I was like, absolutely. I was waiting tables at the time. I had just like no prospects. And that was how I got my start. I was basically a webmaster and freelance web designer for probably 10, 12 years. And then I had the opportunity to join Groupon in 2011. This was about exactly 1 month before the IPO. It was a very interesting time to be at Groupon, and I was hired there as a UI engineer and working on a redesign project that I worked on for 9 months and never saw the light of day. It was very frustrating, but then an opportunity came up to work on our internal tools team, and they needed someone with front-end chops to support these two designers and these like half dozen engineering teams that were making all these internal products. And in my 9 years at Groupon, I ended up making 3 CSS frameworks, and that kind of transitioned into design systems. One of my former managers at Groupon reached out to me from his new company, Provi, and basically did the same thing there. And then yet another former Groupon colleague reached out to me from Turquoise Health and was like, hey, we need someone who he actually messaged me and he said, Mike, do you know anyone who does what you do? And I said, yeah, me. So yeah, I've been at Turquoise now for a little over a year, now on my 5th CSS framework that I've written for design systems, and I think at this point I've got it down to a science. So I like to say that I write CSS so that you don't have to, because pretty much none of our engineers write CSS. It's just they use our framework, and I work with them to kind of make the product look like the picture that the designers made, and I'm probably the only principal engineer in the world that doesn't do anything but write CSS. If there are others, I want to know about it. I want to meet them.
No, it's actually interesting because I feel like it's you nail it where it's like, oh, I write CSS so other people don't have to, because everyone, I feel like most people hate writing CSS. But you're talking about like Turquoise Health. I'm wondering like, what does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, so over the last year, we basically got the design system, from nothing to version 1. And so, the idea, like how we got there is, a lot of design systems practitioners have a hard time like getting design systems work on the roadmap, right? I'm sure you've had those struggles. But the way that I approach it is to let the roadmap guide the design system, right? So as we're building this design system, we're just looking at, okay, what's the next feature that we're trying to build? What are all the things we need to put in the CSS framework to support that? So we'll need some typography, we'll need some buttons, we'll need some form elements, we might need some tables, right? And so we build everything into the system, just what we need to make that feature. And then the next feature, we already have the typography, we have the buttons, we have all that stuff. We might need, less stuff to build that feature. And every successive feature, you need less and less stuff in the design system. And, you know, you get to a certain point where you have your design system handles 95 or more percent of anything anyone has to build. And you only have in your design system what you needed to build that stuff. And you don't have all this like extra stuff, you know. Some people approach design systems from, they make this huge checklist. They're like, okay, we need carousels, we need, you know, alerts, we need this and that. And it's like, don't build that stuff until you actually need it, right? Because it's just a waste of time. And in supporting like what the business is trying to do, it's just making things that much more efficient, you know, building, and you're going to have a lot easier time letting the roadmap guide what goes into the design system rather than saying, hey, we want to build this thing that we might never use in the design system or something. And like, nobody wants to hear that in management, you know, like they're like, why do you work here?
I love that you talk about the roadmap priorities and not wasting time. I think none of us want to waste time, and instead it becomes a struggle with knowing, okay, do I need to build this now or do I wait to build it?
It's hard because like we want to prove that we're valuable, right? And so sometimes we make more work for ourselves to make us look like we're busy. But I'm a big proponent of like, just get done what needs to be done and then go see a movie or something. You know, like just take a long lunch and go see Dune 2 or whatever. And, you know, don't spend your time like stressing about all this stuff that, you know, you don't have to worry about.
I love that. I'm going to incorporate go see a movie as part of our roadmap planning. I think
Friday premieres, like generally there's like 5 people in the theater. It's perfect.
So Mike, that's impressive. You've built 5 frameworks. That's 5 more than I've built. So props. What goes into making a CSS framework? You know, how do you decide when to make your own versus use an existing one? Why have you made 4 more than your first one?
Sure. So, well, like Groupon, you know, the first one was like an experiment. Like, can we make our own Bootstrap, right? And the kind of the reasoning behind it was like we could use Bootstrap, but then we have to write all these additional styles on top of it to support all these different contexts. And Bootstrap wasn't quite at the maturity it is today, where it kind of uses a combination of like component classes and utility classes, right? And I think that's a big reason why our CSS framework enables developers to not have to write CSS now, because of that combination of like components and utility classes. But to answer your question, yeah, like at Groupon though, like different verticals, you know, we had internal tools, we had the consumer site, right, groupon.com, and then we had the merchant vertical, which is like what the merchants see when they're redeeming or they're seeing like how their Groupons are performing and all the metrics and things. So it's kind of like, you know, one is e-commerce and one is a lot more data driven. And so it didn't occur to us at that time, or I should say it didn't occur to me at that time, to make one system that could handle all of those things. But all our internal tools was a lot of like tables and data and stuff like that. And so they kind of have different needs, and I didn't really, it wasn't like we weren't into like design tokens yet where we could do theming and things like that. And that's something that I've evolved into these newer systems. But really it's like getting to the point where, you know, I like to say that writing CSS is just defining visual styles in different contexts over and over until you die, right? Like we're just like, okay, this button is this background color, it has this text color, this padding, this border radius, but you know, there's not a ton of like new HTML elements coming out, right? So we've been styling the same stuff over and over again for the last 30 years, right? And so we're at a point now where like, you know, I could have probably just taken Provi's design system CSS framework and wrote some new tokens, and that would support Turquoise. But I wanted to kind of take advantage of, you know, new features that are now supported, things like container queries and, you know, has and stuff like that. So that we're, you know, I'm trying to solve Turquoise's problems, not just take Provi's design system and slap it a coat of paint on and call it a day, right? I could have done that, but you know, that would be and it's funny. Brad Frost talks about this idea of like a global design system, right? Which I'm not sure about that. Like, for one thing, like that would probably put me out of a job, so I'm not a huge fan of that. But you know, I feel like we kind of already have a global design system. It's HTML and like the default styles, and maybe we just need to do a better job of like making more robust like HTML elements that are, you know, some more common stuff. Things like, you know, I mean, we kind of already have like sliders, but you know, product people are like, oh, what if we had this? And they see stuff on Amazon, and they're like, you know, I want this, you know, and it's like, okay, we're not Amazon. We don't have like thousands of engineers, but you know, yeah.
When you said we're not Amazon, I was picturing like folks trying to shop features on Amazon and wanting to buy that and add it to their cart. And I was
exactly,
like, that's not what Mike's talking about.
I mean, close. Like, oh, I want Amazon's carousel. Just add it to the Mike checkout cart.
So yeah, you talk about a global system, a global language, a way that we can communicate with each other and have a lot of reuse and retooling. And I think I'm like on the same boat. I think HTML, it's a standard, you know.
Yeah.
You mentioned a button's a button. You're not introducing new things all the time. It's pretty stable.
I think out of the box is just not pretty, right? It's Times New Roman, and it's, you know, all this preset padding and margins and stuff. And, you know, some people argue that like Bootstrap is a global design system, right? But it's essentially, it was built to solve Twitter's, you know, problems, and then they open sourced it, and then everybody's like, oh, but it doesn't have this and it doesn't have that, and everybody wants all this stuff to support their needs, and then it becomes this huge monolith of like, now it's trying to solve everybody's problems, right? And so the reason that we ended up building our own CSS framework is that we wanted something that would just solve our problems and nothing else, right?
That makes sense, and it's a way to keep the scope down and not boil the ocean for what you
so that was a drinking game at Groupon. Anytime someone said boil the ocean, it was like, okay.
I love that. You mentioned that you write CSS, so your engineers don't have to. Mm-hmm. How do you organize your code so that it becomes scalable and so it's easy to work with and update and maintain?
Yeah, I think the big key is there's this very fine line between where the system ends and where the product begins, right? And it's kind of tricky to decide. Like, the way I kind of look at it is like, when we're looking at a component, is this a design decision? I mean, is this a design decision or a product decision, right? Like, are we talking about functionality? Is this so complex that like, is this something that I'm going to want to maintain as a design systems person? Like, because what I found at Groupon was we would build these pretty robust components that were based on a lot of product discussions, and then the product people would change that. They would change like how that works based on data or whatever. And then the engineers are like, oh, well, that's not the same as what's in the system. So then they would write their own CSS to make that. And then it gets way out of sync, right? So the key for me is to limit what I'm putting into the system, right? Keep it very like atomic, again, to reference Brad, like atoms and molecules, right? Like the smallest things. And then with the utility classes, like I joke a lot about Tailwind, right? But it's like utilities are good actually, right? It's just you don't want to do everything with utility classes. Like, I don't want to put 30 classes on a button, right? I just want to say button primary, and there's all my styles, right? But maybe, you know, in a certain context, I need that button to have some bottom margin on it, right? So I slap a utility on there that just puts margin on it. So that's what I was talking about when I said, like, it's just applying these visual styles over and over in different contexts. How do I make a system where people can get the styles of the component they need, but then supply them with all of the utilities that they need to compose them in different contexts, right? It's kind of like, I hate the Lego analogy, but like, I'm designing the Legos and they're deciding whether it's Lego Avengers or Lego Harry Potter or Lego Eiffel Tower, right? All of that stuff can work together. You know, you can take pieces from one set and use it in another, but like maybe the Avengers one has this very specific component that you need for like Spider-Man's web slinger or whatever, right? And the design system can support that, but we're not deciding like how that's incorporated into the set, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I've definitely seen folks fall into the trap of making things super specific.
Very specific.
And then you find out a few features later, you go, whoops, I should not have named that class this unique thing dash that goes on this page dash. But I was also distracted because you mentioned border radius 5 pixels, and I have very strong opinions on border radii, but that's another topic for another show. You've mentioned that a lot of engineers, they might not like writing CSS. I personally love CSS, but what do you think contributes to the sentiment of not really liking it overall?
I think a lot of it, how I learned CSS is just by making stuff over and over and over again over the course of since CSS was introduced, basically. And the nice thing about it is like CSS hasn't changed, nothing's replaced it. It has evolved, right? We've gotten new features and things like that, but nothing has, it's not a technology where like, yeah, we don't use that anymore. Now we're using this thing, right? It's not like Flash, right? Or something like that. But again, I think part of it is like, if you have multiple people contributing to CSS in a code base, it makes things infinitely more frustrating, because then you're writing classes to override specificity, and you end up with these classes that are just crazy long, or you're using, in your developer tools, like at Groupon, a lot of people use like Haml, and they would write their CSS like they would write their Haml, right? Where they would use Sass and Haml, and they would indent the Sass like to match the markup, and then you'd end up with these crazy selectors, and they didn't understand like this compiles to CSS and this is what that selector looks like. But in the thing it looks great, great developer experience, but like they're not thinking of like how is this going to work, and how will this affect other things? And also like the browser defaults, right? Like knowing that an H3 has like a built-in margin to it, right? So I have this what I call the Peruvian idle reset, right? And it's 3 things. It's star, right, is the selector, and then it's our old friend box sizing border box. It's margin 0, and it's font inherit, right? And so essentially you're taking all the outer stuff away from stuff. It can keep all the padding and stuff, and we'll adjust that as needed. But then you're also removing any kind of like font styles, right? Including what an H1 looks like. A lot of developers, they'll say, they'll think of it in terms of like the size of an H2 versus the context of an H2, right? And so like, well, I need this to be bigger to match the picture, so I'm going to use an H2, or and so this strips all that out. So now you have to be deliberate and use PV header 2, right, for your class to get that style. But you can apply PV header 2 to an H3 or to a paragraph, right, to get that style, and you can separate the semantics from like what it looks like.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I definitely did the whole indenting my stat styles. Like,
we've all been there.
I was like, this is nice, and then until someone was like, all right, let's take this component out and put it somewhere else, and I was like, so so I've learned my lesson and whatnot. But next question I want to ask is, like, we talked a lot about different methodologies like Tailwind, and then there's frameworks like CS and JS / CSS modules and whatnot. I know you mentioned that you currently don't use any of them. Is there a reason why you avoid or you don't like these like newer technologies?
I wouldn't say that I don't like it, but like the same CSS I wrote 20 years ago still works, right? And we can we've learned a lot of new things. They've added a lot of new things to CSS. So if you were starting from scratch, you probably wouldn't write it the way you did 20 years ago, obviously. But like I said, things like Tailwind and Bootstrap, like those are great if you're, you just need to put up a site or whatever. But like if you're making a product built on those things, then you have like very specific needs that maybe those things don't address, or you have to kind of bend them to your will, and that involves a lot of like kind of hacky stuff, right? So from my point of view, it's like easier to build something from scratch that just solves the problems that you have and is not trying to solve all of those other problems. And I could talk for an hour about what I don't like about some of those frameworks, but I don't want to be accused of using my platform to attack other people. But things like CSS and JS and CSS modules and stuff like that, I'm just like, that's like a huge red flag to me. Like, just stop, don't do that, get it out of there. Like, the nice thing about how our CSS framework works is like, sometimes you're working at a company where your data scientists are using Python, and somebody else is using React, someone else is using Svelte, right? And you can't support, how do you write CSS inside of those components, right? It's much easier to just have this framework you can use and sprinkle those classes in all of these other things, and it's not dependent on any single technology. And it frees those developers up to focus on how the thing works rather than what it looks like, right? Like our documentation site has little code snippets where, if you need a very specific style, you can go in there and copy and paste that, and then just kind of put your, kind of wire it up, so to speak, with your framework of choice. But we're not opinionated about like, oh, this is React or this is, Vue or something like that. We can support all of those things.
I'm not gonna lie, that's one thing I miss about using vanilla CSS, where it's like you just like copy and paste it and it'll work. But if you're using like CSS modules, or it's just kind of like there's an extra step, and I'm like, is there another way of doing this? And I think there's a big movement where people are like the no build solution, where it's like we're just gonna use the vanilla way and see how it works. And
yeah,
I'm kind of leaning towards that, but again, there's some things I like, some things I dislike. But
there's this. There's this thing that I refer to as the fetishization of encapsulation, right? Like, people are obsessed with like encapsulating their stuff in this component so nothing leaks out, and it's like the reason that they're so focused on that is because like their experience in writing CSS makes it like you can't do that just with class names, but you absolutely can. You don't necessarily need to encapsulate that, because then you're essentially just getting into, again, writing stuff for this specific context where you can't use it outside of those things, and nothing from outside can override it. And so now you're maintaining it in all these separate components, and it's just like, it's a nightmare.
Yeah, I literally ran through that issue where it's like someone's like, "Oh, we need to change this in the design system because we don't want this to be like leak out." And I'm like, "Well, that's the whole purpose, where it's like it's a global style." So that goes back to your point about like the education standpoint, because I think there's a lot of people that don't really understand the cascade and whatnot. And my next question is more a case of like, we talked about there's a mixture between like semantic, CSS, and utility classes. I'm wondering, like, you talked about this before, but I'm wondering, like, how do you know when to use one or the other? Because I know there's some cases where people are just like, they're like, oh, if it's a utility class, then why can't I just like, extend it within my within like my component, versus like having that like actual utility class in the HTML.
Yeah, I mean, you could extend it, but like then again, you're doing like, this is only serving this one context, right? So the idea is like, we have this kind of base component style, say a primary button, and then that, we have a secondary button that maybe has a different background color, different hover styles, things like that, and we can just put that in one class. But then in a different context, you might need that thing to have, in the container that it sits in that context, it might need different margin or padding between elements. And that's where the utilities come in. And so those utilities are written in a way where like it's only doing the one thing you need it to do to compose those things. So all the component styles define what's in the component, and the utilities are like, how do those components fit together? Or are there cases where we need to override things? And if things are, if they're seeing a Figma that's like, well, the design system doesn't support this, then it's kind of my job to say, well, you could do that this way or this way, or we can also update the system to accommodate this need. Like we're not we're not enforcing design. We're kind of we're like curating design, right? Like we're curating the ways that we build these things. We're not saying like you can only do it this way, and if you can't do it that way, and that gets frustrating for people, that's when they go off the reservation and they start doing their own CSS without your knowledge, and then it breaks stuff, right? So if we can just work with the developers and support them in like getting the stuff that they need, and also working with the designers to make sure that the UI kit that they're working with and our framework are in sync, so that you kind of don't have those discrepancies. That's kind of the tricky part.
I love how you say like we're curators of design. I just had to imagine of like being in a museum and people are like, hey, like you want to come into like my design system museum, and you know, guiding them through like all the specific galleries and whatnot. Sorry, rant. I'm wondering, like, one thing I've seen with utility classes is that like sometimes people wanted to act differently, like between different viewports. Like, how
Sure.
would you support that? Because I know there's like a tailwind of doing it, but I know people have very mixed reactions about how they do it. So I'm wondering, like, from your perspective, your approach.
Yeah. So the kind of the methodology that I use, right, has kind of three big parts. It has components that we talked about, utilities, which we talked about, and then the third part is layout. So we're never setting like explicit sizes on components. We're kind of letting them just fill whatever container they're in. And so we do that through these layouts, and it could be like a page level layout, or it could be a like a nested layout type thing. And so we're not using like a big kind of thing that's in all of these frameworks is like the grid, right? The 12 column grid. I hate that. It's like it's the worst. Like designers don't use it. Engineers get frustrated with it. There's a site by Donnie D'Amato that called gridless.design, I believe is the URL. And he talks all about like why the grid is nuts. Yeah, to answer your question, now we can use container queries, right? So we can apply those to certain components so that we're not so reliant on media queries. Typically, I've approached it from like there's just one breakpoint, and there's kind of small screens and larger screens, and then we have kind of our layouts have a kind of max width, right? We don't want to go beyond like 1200 or 1400 or whatever, and so we use these layouts to kind of constrain the components within that, and then the layout shifts at the breakpoint, and then those things change. But again, now we can add container queries to fine tune that on individual components. But we can mostly solve things by just hiding and showing things at certain breakpoints. So we have utilities that are like hide on small, hide on large, that we can then, because designers, they love to make a desktop view and a phone view, and they don't tell you what happens in between, right? So it's just like, but then the stuff is like the markup is out of order in their design, and it's like, I can't really, you can't solve that. So you have to make two of them and show the big one on mobile, and the big one on desktop, and the small one on mobile has completely different markup. And that's kind of how I've solved that issue. And no one's complained about it yet. So like, all right, well, I guess I'm doing it this way.
Yeah, it's almost like spot the difference between the two views, and it's like a little mini game.
Yeah, I mean, the education goes both ways, right? Like in my role, I'm
So Mike, you mentioned, using utility classes to talk about like your spacing. You're doing a one-off, like you need some margin bottom on a button. Let's say you have a group of cards, and the developer has gone in and they've added margins to separate those cards. But then you decide, hey, I actually want to standardize the spacing between those cards, or we want to create more of a pattern versus just a one-off component.
Andy Bell has solved this problem. and maybe he got it from somewhere else, but he has a flow utility, right? Which you slap it on a container, and it gives all of the children in that container equal margin, right? So I believe the way he does it, he uses what's called the lobotomized owl selector, right? Star plus star. So anything within that container that comes after another one will have top margin applied to it of a specific space. The way I approach it is a little different. I do the children that are not the last child have this much bottom margin. So, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, as my wife likes to say. But then our utility classes also have, utilities for adjusting margin, right? So we just have like a stack class that puts some amount of margin on the bottom. And so that can actually override the flow. The flow is in like a where, selector, so that it's giving it, but it's giving that style, but it has no specificity, right? And so then if I apply a bottom margin to one that needs to be different, I can do that on an individual component. And so that bottom margin isn't applied to the component itself, but we're putting all of these components inside of a container. Because usually that's just it's like one card, right? That's just pulling data and making multiple cards. It's like in some kind of, for each card in cards, make this block of HTML or whatever. And so that's where having these containers come in. Like, I'm a big proponent of divs. People talk about, nested divs. But like, if you need that to create, to apply utilities to handle the children of that thing, or to apply some padding around things. I think a lot of stuff that's difficult for, particularly junior devs is like the difference between margin and padding. Like, should I use padding here? Should I use margin? And how does that work? But yeah, that's kind of the key, right? Is to think about what should be solved by the component itself, and what should be in the parent that applies to all of the children, and using like inheritance, right? Like, use the cascade and let it do its thing.
Yeah, I love how you like broke that down, because I strongly believe that not many people understand the cascade. And I was like, even for me, like beginning my career, I was like, this thing sucks. I'm just gonna put important and just like, let it ride.
Important everywhere, yeah. YOLO.
And I got in trouble for that, and I think I did the same thing when I was like, I'm just gonna use inline styles, and that was a whole other cluster of mishaps. So I do like the idea where it says like you should trust the cascade and whatnot, because then you could like override it if necessary, if that makes sense. Cool.
Yeah, and we actually, sorry, one more thing. We actually use inline styles a little bit in our system, and we use CSS custom properties, right? So if there's a few things where like we don't write a class for every possible variation of a value, so we put that at the top inside the class in a custom property, and it has a default, but if they need it to be different from the default, they can put that in an inline style through that custom property, if that makes sense. So we do like allow for it, but it's like it's very specific, and it's documented that you can use these specific custom properties to override the defaults of the system. But it really kind of frees people up to do things however they need to, without having to write a bunch of extra CSS. It sounds crazy, but if you check out our documentation site, you'll find stuff like that, where there's a little table at the top of the component that says, here's the stuff you can use to override the defaults, and here's what the default is if you need it to be different from that.
Oh, wow, yeah, I definitely have to check that out, because I was like, I got a little worried. I was like, wait, custom, like, inline styles? I was like, uh-oh. But... yeah,
people, like, there's certain things in CSS where, like, it's just, we've been conditioned that stuff is bad, right? Divs are bad, and inline styles are bad, and all this stuff. But like, everything is fine if you use it in moderation, like where it's supposed to be, like utility classes, right? Like, it's fine if you use utility classes. If everything's a utility, it gets very, complex. But everything in moderation, right?
I love it. Yeah, definitely have to check that out. So to close out this episode, Mike, let's say someone is listening and is like, oh, I want to be a principal design system engineer. What is one piece of advice you could give them?
Yeah, I would say like no one's really hiring principal design systems engineers. The way that I found success is to just get in where you can, right? Like I got in at Groupon as a UI engineer with like a webmaster background, and just found my niche in CSS, and that was what I was interested in, and that was where I found I could provide the most value. One of the best pieces of advice that I got in my career was like getting from junior to principal is about the impact that you have on the organization. So you go from you're just impacting the feature that you're working on to you're impacting your team, your department, the entire company, right? Maybe your thing is animation, but just get in where you can, and then find a thing that you're into and make that your thing. And then you become the person who, oh, that's Mike, he's the CSS guy, right? And that's literally how I got every job since Groupon. Is somebody at Groupon was like, oh man, I wish we had a Mike here. Like, I was like, we need somebody who's like specializes in this thing. So yeah, that's the advice I would give, is just get your foot in the door, and then from there, find what you're into and make that your thing, right? And not all companies' culture supports that. I've been very fortunate that like the places that I've worked have been, usually if there's a thing that you're into that nobody else has any experience of, then they're happy to have you lend that expertise, right?
Love it. I think that's very sound advice. Cool. And then, do you have anything you want to plug, or you want to give someone a shout out? Just wondering.
Not really. I'm not doing a whole lot. Kicking around an idea of a newsletter. Everyone's doing newsletters now, but I don't want to do like a design systems newsletter because there's already 100 of those, and so I was thinking about doing one that's just like all of the good stuff that I watch on screens, movies, TV, video games, whatever, and it's going to be called Peruvian Idol, IDLE. So we'll see. But yeah, you can find me at mikeaparicio.com, or I am Peruvian Idol pretty much everywhere on the internet. It's pretty easy to find me.
Cool. Yeah, definitely let us know when that happens, because I'm also in the case where I'm like, I want to learn more about stuff outside design systems. So anything that's like out of the box, I'm willing to like listen to.
Great.
So, cool. Mike, thanks again for joining us today. We want to give a special shout out to our listeners who are tuning in today's episode. For more content, feel free to go to our website where we have all our episodes. And cool. And also connect us in social media, X, Twitter, LinkedIn, and whatnot. And yeah, have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.